Imagine a prehistoric man, half-starved and covered in mud, stumbling across a fallen mammoth that has been dead for 3 days and is beginning to smell like a biological experiment gone wrong. He does not pull out a smartphone to check the nutritional content. He does not portion control. He does not consider whether this aligns with his paleo diet plan. He eats until his stomach feels like it is about to file a formal complaint with his nervous system, and then he keeps eating, because the part of his brain that processes long-term planning has not yet evolved past the point of recognizing that tomorrow might not exist. This is the world our ancestors inhabited, a world where calories were not a moral failing, but a mathematical miracle. And the question we are asking today is whether any of them ever managed to become genuinely, clinically obese in an environment that was essentially one long, continent-wide famine with occasional breaks for violence. The short answer is complicated. The long answer requires us to look at archaeology, genetics, evolutionary biology, and the deeply unfortunate reality that the human body is essentially a biological hoarder that never learned when to stop collecting. To understand why obesity was theoretically possible but practically unlikely in the ancient world, we need to start with the brain, because the brain is the real architect of this entire disaster. Our craving for sugar and fat is not a character flaw or a weakness of willpower. It is a survival mechanism that was forged in the Pleistocene, which was basically a 2.6 million year-long camping trip where the weather was terrible and the snacks were non-existent. Sugar in the wild comes from things like wild berries, which are small, seasonal, and often protected by thorns, insects, or bears that have already called dibs. Fat comes from animals that are notoriously difficult to catch and even more difficult to kill without becoming a snack yourself. Because these nutrients were so rare, the human brain evolved a reward system that treats sugar and fat like winning the biological lottery. When an ancient human found a beehive full of honey, their brain would flood with dopamine in a way that makes modern junk food look like a participation trophy. The problem, of course, is that this system was designed for scarcity, not for a world where you can buy a family-sized bag of sour gummy worms at 3 in the morning from a gas station. Our brains are still running software from 30,000 years ago on hardware that is expected to process modern grocery stores. And the result is a system that screams, "Eat everything," in an environment where everything is already eaten, packaged, and preserved with chemicals that our ancestors would have mistaken for witchcraft. This brings us to the archaeological evidence, which is where things get genuinely strange, and, if you are the kind of person who enjoys unsettling ancient art, deeply fascinating. The Venus figurines are a collection of small statues carved from stone, bone, and ivory, dating back roughly 30,000 years, and they depict women with exaggerated features, including massive hips, enormous breasts, and stomachs that would make a modern sumo wrestler look understated. The most famous of these is the Venus of Willendorf, a 4-inch tall limestone figure discovered in Austria in 1908, which looks less like a human being and more like a fertility symbol designed by someone who had never actually seen a human being but had heard them described in great detail by a very confused person. For decades, archaeologists debated whether these figurines were representations of actual obese women, idealized symbols of fertility and abundance, or some kind of abstract artistic expression that we are simply too modern to understand. The prevailing theory has shifted over time, but what remains undeniable is that the people who carved these statues had a concept of extreme body fat. They could imagine it, they could represent it, and that suggests, at minimum, that obesity was not entirely outside the realm of human experience, even in a world where most people were one bad hunting season away from starving to death. But here is where we need to separate imagination from epidemiology, because the ability to carve an obese statue does not mean that obesity was common, or even that it was achievable for more than a tiny fraction of the population. The Venus figurines might represent elite members of society who had access to surplus food, or they might represent a symbolic ideal that had nothing to do with actual body size. What they almost certainly do not represent is the average Paleolithic woman, who was likely lean, muscular, and covered in scars from a lifetime of doing things that would make a modern CrossFit instructor weep with exhaustion. The archaeological record of actual human remains tells a very different story from the artistic record. Studies of ancient skeletons consistently show that prehistoric humans were, on average, significantly leaner than modern populations, with bone structures that suggest high levels of physical activity and diets that were diverse but rarely calorie-dense in the way that modern diets are. The bones do not lie, and the bones say that most ancient humans were eating just enough to survive, and not a single calorie more. However, and this is a significant however, there is growing evidence that some individuals did manage to accumulate substantial body fat, and that this accumulation was tied to social status, gender, and access to resources in ways that might feel uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has ever noticed that wealth and waistlines tend to correlate in modern society. In many hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies, food was shared communally, but the distribution was not always equal. Leaders, shamans, and high-status individuals may have had preferential access to the most calorie-dense foods, and in some societies, female obesity was actively encouraged as a sign of beauty, fertility, or wealth. The Efik people of Nigeria, for example, historically practiced fattening rituals for women before marriage. And while this is an ethnographic example from a much later period, it demonstrates that human societies have long understood the relationship between food surplus and body size, and have sometimes actively pursued obesity as a cultural goal. The question is whether similar dynamics existed in the deep past, and the answer is that they probably did, but only in very specific, very limited contexts. This is where genetics enters the conversation, and where we need to talk about the thrifty gene hypothesis, which is one of the most influential and controversial ideas in modern evolutionary medicine. The hypothesis, first proposed by geneticist James Neal in 1962, suggests that certain human populations evolved genes that make them exceptionally efficient at storing energy as fat. In an environment where food was scarce and unpredictable, these genes were a superpower. They allowed individuals to survive long periods of famine by slowly metabolizing their stored fat reserves. They turned a meager diet into a biological savings account that could be drawn upon during hard times. The problem, of course, is that these genes did not come with an off switch, and when the environment changed from one of scarcity to one of abundance, the biological savings account became a biological debt trap. Populations that had historically faced repeated famines, such as many indigenous groups in the Americas and Pacific Islanders, now face some of the highest rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes in the world, not because of any failure of willpower or culture, but because their bodies are doing exactly what they were designed to do in an environment that no longer exists. The thrifty gene hypothesis has been criticized and refined over the decades, with some researchers arguing that it is too simplistic and that the genetic picture is far more complex than a single set of thrifty genes. What is not in dispute, however, is that human metabolism varies significantly between populations and individuals, and that much of this variation is rooted in our evolutionary history. Some people are naturally lean regardless of what they eat, and others gain weight at the mere thought of a carbohydrate. This is not a moral difference, it is a biological one, and it is a difference that was shaped by the specific environmental pressures that our ancestors faced. If you are someone who gains weight easily, there is a very good chance that your body is simply better at surviving a famine than the body of someone who can eat an entire pizza without consequence. It is a cruel irony that the very metabolic efficiency that might have saved your life in the Pleistocene is now considered a medical problem in the 21st century. But let us return to the ancient world, because the genetics only tell half the story. Even if an ancient human had the most efficient thrifty genes imaginable, they still needed access to surplus calories to become obese, and surplus calories were extraordinarily difficult to come by. Hunter-gatherer societies typically operated on what anthropologists call the work and wait model, where periods of intense physical activity were followed by periods of relative inactivity and food shortage. The Hadza people of Tanzania, who are often studied as a model for ancient human lifestyles, consume a diet that is diverse and nutrient-rich but rarely excessive in calories. Their daily energy expenditure, when adjusted for body size, is roughly comparable to that of modern Westerners, which challenges the simple narrative that ancient humans were constantly burning more calories than we are. But the Hadza do not have access to processed foods, refined sugars, or the kind of calorie-dense, nutrient-poor diet that defines modern eating. They eat when food is available, they stop when they are full, and they do not have a cultural or economic system that encourages overconsumption. Agriculture changed this equation, but not as dramatically as we might expect. The transition from hunting and gathering to farming, which began around 12,000 years ago, did increase food availability in some regions, but it also introduced new problems. Early agricultural diets were often less diverse and more reliant on a small number of staple crops, which could lead to nutritional deficiencies even when calories were technically sufficient. The skeletons of early farmers show signs of stunted growth, dental disease, and infectious diseases that were less common in hunter-gatherer populations, suggesting that the agricultural revolution was not an immediate ticket to abundance and obesity. It was, in many ways, a trade-off between food security and food quality, and the trade-off did not immediately result in widespread weight gain. It took thousands of years of agricultural intensification, food storage, and social stratification before surplus calories became reliable enough to support obesity in anything more than isolated cases. When we do see evidence of obesity in the ancient world, it tends to appear in specific contexts that highlight the relationship between power, gender, and food. The elite members of ancient civilizations, from Egyptian pharaohs to Roman emperors, certainly had access to enough food to become obese, and some of them did. The Roman physician Galen wrote about overweight individuals and recommended treatments that included exercise, massage, and dietary changes, which suggests that obesity was a recognized medical condition in the classical world, at least among the wealthy. But these were outliers in societies where the vast majority of people were engaged in physical labor and had limited access to surplus food. The obesity of the elite was a sign of their separation from the masses, a visible marker of their ability to consume without working, and in many ways, it was the ancient equivalent of a luxury brand logo. The Venus figurines, then, might be read as an even older version of this same dynamic. If they represent actual women, they may represent high-status individuals who had access to food surpluses that were denied to others. If they represent an ideal, they may reflect a cultural value placed on fatness as a sign of health, fertility, and wealth in a world where most people were thin by necessity. The fact that we cannot definitively answer this question is itself telling, because it reveals how little we know about the social lives of ancient humans and how much we project our own assumptions onto the past. We want the Venus figurines to be either proof of ancient obesity or proof of ancient body positivity, but the reality is probably messier and more interesting than either of those narratives allow. What we can say with reasonable certainty is that obesity, as a widespread population-level phenomenon, did not exist in the ancient world. The conditions necessary for mass obesity, which include reliable access to calorie-dense foods, sedentary lifestyles, and cultural norms that encourage overconsumption, simply were not present in any sustained way until the modern era. Individual cases of obesity almost certainly occurred, particularly among elites and in societies with unusual food surpluses, but these were exceptions that proved the rule of scarcity. The human body was designed to store fat, but it was also designed to burn it, and for most of human history, the balance was maintained by an environment that simply did not allow for sustained overconsumption. And now we arrive at the modern trap, which is where this entire historical journey becomes deeply uncomfortable. The world we live in today is, from an evolutionary perspective, a kind of hallucination. It is a world where the biological mechanisms that our ancestors relied upon for survival have become the very things that are killing us. Our brains still light up at the sight of sugar and fat because they are programmed to treat these nutrients as rare and valuable. Our bodies still store every excess calorie as if a famine is imminent, because for 2 million years, a famine was always imminent. We are cavemen in a candy store, and the candy store is open 24 hours a day, and the caveman part of our brain does not understand why we would ever stop eating when food is so abundant. The result is a global obesity epidemic that would be utterly incomprehensible to our ancestors, not because they lacked the biological capacity for obesity, but because they lacked the environmental conditions that make obesity inevitable. The diet industry, which is worth billions of dollars, is essentially a modern attempt to trick our bodies into behaving as if we are still living in the Pleistocene. We sell pills that suppress appetite, surgeries that shrink stomachs, and exercise programs that simulate the physical labor that our ancestors did out of necessity. We are trying to recreate the conditions of scarcity in a world of abundance, and we are failing because the human body is not designed to be tricked. It is designed to survive, and in a world where survival no longer requires physical exertion or dietary restraint, the body's survival mechanisms have become maladaptive. The thrifty genes that saved our ancestors are now predisposing us to diabetes, heart disease, and a host of other conditions that are the direct result of metabolic systems that cannot adjust to a world they were never meant to inhabit. There is a particular kind of cruelty in this because it means that our ancestors' greatest survival weapon has become our greatest weakness. The ability to store body fat was not a flaw, it was a feature. And it was a feature that allowed the human species to survive ice ages, droughts, plagues, and countless other disasters that should have wiped us out. We are here today because our ancestors were good at getting fat when food was available and good at surviving when it was not. But evolution does not care about the future. It only cares about the past, and the past is a terrible guide to a world of supermarkets and desk jobs. The body that carried our species through the worst conditions the planet could offer is now struggling to carry us through the best conditions the planet has ever provided. And the result is a kind of metabolic whiplash that is playing out in hospitals and clinics around the world. So, could ancient humans become obese? The answer is yes, but with so many caveats that the yes almost becomes meaningless. A high-status individual with favorable genetics and access to a rare food surplus might have managed it, and the Venus figurines suggest that such individuals were at least imaginable to the people who carved them. But for the vast majority of ancient humans, obesity was not a risk, because starvation was the far more pressing concern. They lived in a world where every calorie was earned through effort, danger, and often violence, and where the body's fat storage system was a necessary insurance policy against an uncertain future. We live in a world where calories are cheap, effort is optional, and the insurance policy has become a liability. The ancient human who gorged on mammoth fat was doing exactly what their body was designed to do. The modern human who gorges on fast food is doing exactly the same thing. The only difference is the world around them, and that difference is everything.